It's also a great privilege to be here and talk about these huge topics, science and faith. What does it mean to be human? What is life about? Those are really great questions. I'm going to zoom in just on a small subset of these on science and faith. And really, rather than doing something very constructive, I'm going to try to wipe away do a bit of a ground clearing exercise and wipe away what I call some zombie myths. I call them zombie myths because it's like a zombie. We keep chopping at them and they keep coming up. So I call them some zombie myths about science and faith. So one of them is the idea that conflict is the correct metaphor for the history of science and faith. And it goes a little bit like this, back in the Dark Ages, we did bad things to each other and we didn't really understand things very well. And then we thought gods caused the thunder, and now we have science and enlightenment and rationality, and everything is getting better. And this is a popular trope which I've put up a bit as a straw man, but some version of it floats around. Now, I'm not a historian of science, although I've spent a lot of time reading history of science. But most of my friends who are historians of science they get very upset by this story because they feel that it really doesn't do justice at all to the complexities of their interaction with science and faith. So here's my colleague Peter Harrison, until recently at Oxford, who said, those who argue for the incompatibility of science and religion will draw little comfort from history. The myth of a perennial conflict between science and religion is one to which no historian of science would subscribe. So Peter is one of the world's great historians of science, and I'm just basically quoting him here to point this out. In fact, a series of historians, including Peter and others, put together a book, if you like this kind of stuff, called Galileo Goes to Jail, and 25 other myths about science and religion. Try to put to rest this idea that religion and science are a conflict. In fact, modern science, as we know it, arose very much in a Christian context by people who took their Christian faith extremely seriously. It turns out that you need certain kind of premises about the way the world is, that the world is repeatable, the world is rational. Those are ideas that came historically from theological thinking about the world, and in that kind of fertile set of ideas, that's where science arose. It may no longer really worry that much about where the roots came from, but definitely that is one important thing you think about where science comes from. So science has a deep historical roots in Christianity. I'll just leave that there. The second kind of zombie myth is that believing in God is like believing in a pink unicorn or a flying teapot. So every so often I'll say, I'm a scientist, and I'm a Christian, a very serious Christian, I take my faith very seriously, and people will say, oh, how could that be possible? Aren't you, believing a bunch of impossible things before breakfast? And I have another colleague in Oxford, Richard Dawkins, who has this quote on believing in God. He says, if you want to believe in teapots, unicorns, or tooth fairies, Thor or Yahweh, the onus is on you to say why you believe in it. The onus is not on the rest of us to say why we do not. We who are atheists are also atheists, teapotists, and unicornists, but we don't have to bother saying so. And so what's coming in this argument, which is what I hear quite frequently, is an asymmetry argument. The idea that if I believe in God, I need to give you evidence for it. The default option is that there is no God. The first thing about this is we have to ask ourselves, what kind of God are we speaking about? So if I come to you and say, I've discovered a new virus in my laboratory, you're justified in being skeptical and saying, I'm an new viruses until you give me evidence for it. That's how science works, and that's a great thing about science. But God is not some kind of object out there. We don't think that God is, an animal like ourselves, only bigger and smarter than us. God is the reason why this is what Christians believe, that God is the reason why the universe exists. If God were to stop existing, it's not like the universe is grind to a halt. It would also stop existing. So it's something fundamentally different. And one way of unpacking that is to ask very simple questions, like, why is there a universe? Why are there the laws of nature? Where do they come from? Well, there are various options. One option would be the laws of nature as we know them today, the ones that create our current universe from a Big Bang, came from some previous sets of laws of nature. So some previous set of laws of nature caused those, which then in turn were caused by another one, and you get infinite regressive causes. That could be possible, but it's extremely odd. How can you say it's very odd? It's because where they come from, and what does it mean to have an infinite of causes. Another option is the laws of nature as we know it came into being from real nothingness. And by that I mean ontological nothingness, nothingness, no laws of logic, no laws of mathematics, true nothingness. It's also possible, but it's kind of weird. The third option is that the laws of nature itself, comes from something outside of nature. Perhaps a being who cannot not exist, the kind of God of classical theism. Now, you may also find that odd. My only point is that all three of these options are, in one way or the other, odd. The world is actually odd. Thinking about these things are odd. And it's not always a priori which of those three, or maybe there's two, one of them has no God, one does have a God, you should start from. But the point is, they're not an asymmetric one. They're something that you can think about. And in fact, how should you think about them? This is John Polkinghorne, a famous mathematical physicist at the other place, as we like to say in Oxford. If we are to understand the nature of reality, we have only two possible starting points. Either the brute fact of the physical world, or the brute fact of a divine will and purpose behind that physical world. In other words, what Professor Polkinghorne is saying is either the world has a divine origin or it does not. And the way that you kind of think about these questions is not by trying to find evidence for one or evidence for the other. You actually start from the perspective, perhaps there's a God in this world, and look at the world and ask yourself, does that make more sense of the world? Or you can start from the idea, maybe there is no God, then look at the world in all its complexity and ask yourself, does that make more sense of the world? And that's the best way of thinking about these things. But asymmetry is a kind of simplistic and incorrect way of thinking about it. All right, and the last zombie myth, which is the one that's closest to the title of today's discussion, which I'm really looking forward to. We had a very nice dinner with Pascal already, where he told us some amusing stories, so I'm looking forward to hearing from you. No pressure. That was fun. Science is the best avenue, the best way to get truth for ultimate questions. And I think this is often, why are a lot of people here tonight to listen to two kind of academics drone on about science and big questions? It's because I think, besides the fact that perhaps my co-speaker is extremely well known for his teaching and other things in this institution, I'm not that well known at all here, I'm assuming. So why did you come? I think it's because fundamentally we know that science has brought us great advances, right? So science has brought us this little miniature computer that I can fit in my pocket, which is incredibly powerful. It can do all kinds of, I can communicate with my family instantaneously all the way across the water, do all kinds of amazing things. I can use it to watch cat videos, all the kinds of things that people do. And so clearly there's been enormous advancement in technology, there's been enormous advancement in medicine. And it's not unnatural to think, well, given those great advances that we've had, the fact that we're much healthier than we were before, the fact that we have all this technology around us, surely that way of thinking is going to also answer the big questions like, who am I, and what does it mean to be human, and what does it mean to be a good life, and who's right and who's wrong about various questions. Now, I think science is a fantastic, amazing thing. I think it's the greatest invention that human beings have ever made. But, and here I'll quote another Oxford professor, Peter Medawar, an atheist actually, who won the Nobel Prize quite a few years ago in medicine, who said this: that there is indeed a limit on science is made very likely by the existence of questions that science cannot answer, that no conceivable advance of science would empower it to answer. These are the questions that children ask, the ultimate questions of Karl Popper. Popper is a famous philosopher. I have in mind these questions as, how did everything begin? So we just touched on. What are we all here for? What is the point of living? It is not the science, therefore, but the metaphysics, magic literature, or religion that we must turn for answers to questions having to do with first and last things. And this comes just after a very flowery quote about how great science is. Science is a great thing, fantastic, but it can't answer these questions. And to make it answer these questions is wrong. Fundamentally, we're all philosophers and theologians. We have ideas about what is right and wrong, what the world is like. And whether we have those ideas very consciously or whether we kind of pick them up from the environment around us, we are philosophers or theologians. And that means that we have to think a little bit about a whole series of scientific questions. And I'm going to give you one, just to give you an example of something, how you might think about some kind of scientific question and what it means to the big question. So let's say I treat the question of what I'm made of. So you can imagine the following scenario. You are out with a very, let's say, I'll pick on I won't pick on anybody actually. So, but one of you young men is out with a beautiful young lady, and it's a nice time in Greenwich Village, and you've got a really nice restaurant, and the light is low, and there's all the kinds of things that you have to have, some candles and some flowers, and she says to you, you know, what am I really made of? And you know this is, of course, a very dangerous question, and so you panic a little bit, because if you get it wrong, that might be bad, and so you think you're made of chemicals. In fact, we're all made of chemicals. In fact, you're about 60% water, you're enough phosphorus for 2,000 matches, enough iron for 1 nail, enough chlorine to disinfect the swimming pool, and enough fat for 10 bars of soap, at which point you'll get a big slap. And if you make up 1 bar of soap, that is the end. So I advise you not to do so. But the point is, of course, none of this is not true. We are made of chemicals. In fact, I am a bag of chemicals. I am a wet computer. I am a kind of machine. I am also an animal. All those things are true about myself. But the idea that I'm nothing but one of those things is a very easy way to make science somehow give answers to things that it shouldn't give answers to. Here's another example that I wanted to kind of play out to help you think about this. Let's say one day you come to my house and there's some water boiling on the stove. And you ask me, why is the water boiling? And I say, well, the water is boiling because there's a heat source that's transferring thermal energy across the container wall into the water. That increases the mean square velocity of the water molecules. And once that's directly proportional to temperature. And once that temperature reaches 100 degrees Celsius, there's a phase transition from a condensed phase to an expanded phase. And that's what we call boiling. The other option would be, I fancy a cup of tea. Would you like some? Now, both of those are true. And just the way I give you a mechanistic answer to something doesn't mean that I've therefore exhausted all the meaning is there. There's multiple levels of meaning, multiple ways of thinking about something that are equally valid and important. And the last example I want to give in my last slide is just give, I think, a more important question about how science could ascertain important questions of value. So let's take an incredibly pertinent, important question. What is the value of a human being? Do humans have value? Well, this underpins our modern society, our modern legal system, our modern political system, how we interact with one another. And I hope most of you in this audience believe that humans have some kind of intrinsic value. Their value is because they're humans. But how would you measure that? Well, what would you do? If you were a chemist, would you measure the value of the elements? Or if you're a psychologist, the size of your brain, or a physiologist, a psychologist, how smart you are, or an economist, how much you produce. All those are options, but none of them are the right way of measuring the value of a human being. In fact, I go further and say it's dangerous to start relating the value of a human being to some kind of measurable trait. When you start doing that, some kind of scientifically measurable trait, you do that, you actually devalue humans, and it's dangerous. So Christians would say the value of human beings comes fundamentally from the fact that they are willed and loved by God. Therefore, it's independent of any of these measurable qualities. You may believe, as many of my family members are humanists, and they believe this is just a brute fact about the world. They don't believe in a God. They think it's just the way it is. There's no reason for it. This is the way it is. I think that's very valuable. That's also a valuable way of thinking about it. But it's incredibly important that you don't think that science is going to answer this question, because it won't. And so I thought I'd give you those little examples to help you think a little bit and hopefully inspire some questions. The Q&A is often the funnest part of these events. So hopefully you agree with some of what I've said, hopefully you disagree with some of it, and you can come and talk to me later about it. And that's it. Last thing I would say is, this is kind of funny on this website, but I've recently made a documentary series called Why Are We Here? WhyAreWeHere.tv. You can read it if you want to see more of these kinds of questions. I also like to plug it since it's just come out. And with that, thank you very much for your attention.
So I'm going to talk to you today about what can science do for you. And before I'm going to tell you that, I want to first emphasize that's going to be a tough act to follow. No pressure, right? But yeah, so thanks to the Veritas Forum for inviting me inexplicably, and thanks all of you for coming. But let's see, maybe we can make it worth it by talking about is this on. Can you see the clicker? You cannot see the clicker, right? Yeah, there's no laser pointer here, right? No. It's out of battery, I guess. So I'll just use this. So I'm actually going to jump in a lot of the things that Ard already touched upon. So what you see here on this slide is basically a inflation-adjusted graph of the world GDP over the last 2,000 years. And what you can see here is that there was a scientific revolution around here, followed by an industrial revolution here. And to summarize the whole slide, and this is by the inflation adjusted. Yeah, basically nothing much happened for like thousands of years. And then all of a sudden things took off. And this, to touch upon some things Ard mentioned, this actually underestimates the real progress, because technology, like I said, like this, the very slide you're looking at, the Facebook group you sign up with, like everything that you use to come here, everything of value that you use on a daily basis was basically created in the last 500 years, which is not coincidentally in the immediate aftermath of the printing press, which basically made the industrial scientific revolution possible. So anyway, so to make a long story short, science has been amazingly beneficial to human endeavors. So I guess the first answer to our question would be, yes, science can do a lot for us. Without science, we'd all still be in a hopeless Malthusian trap, just all kind of fighting each other, I guess, which we did for thousands of years. But before we go into other pros and cons, I want to just briefly touch upon what science is. I would argue that science is a formalized process with the goal of understanding natural phenomena. So basically you have down here the physical world, reality on the bottom, and what we do there is we observe and describe that physical reality. We have also observations, scientists call this measurements. And then we have a world of ideas in the clouds. We make theories that form an understanding of the natural world. And what links that is we're using a process of induction, actually. We try to explain these observations. They're just random. We have a theory, and then very important, this is the most critical part. This is like a cycle. It's kind of like a water cycle. So just like a mudder, a scientist's job is never done. You go through this cycle over and over and over again. Because this last step here, the prediction, based on your understanding of these observations, you make a prediction. And if I'm right, X should happen. And you make new observations in a very targeted way, usually an experiment, to test yourself. And that is what science does that, to my knowledge, no other human endeavor really does, because otherwise we're often just caught in like confirmation bias. We're trying to confirm what we already know. But science deliberately, as if at least it works well, is supposed to like challenge yourself, challenge your ideas. And again, so you go through the cycle over and over again. And so in this sense, actually the German word Wissenschaft captures it better than the Latin word Scientia. Scientia is a body of knowledge, a bunch of facts. That's not true. It's a process. It's a never-ending process. We're writing the manual of life, and it's always a draft. All right. And I'll give you a specific example of biology. So science, for instance, would catch a bug, and we would count the number of hairs on its legs, as science does. There's a lot of things we say only in science would a grown man ever endeavor such a thing, right? And then we capture a bunch of them, and we make, this is describing. We're making like a family tree of the phylogeny of the bugs, like Linnaeus did. That's pure descriptive. We're describing how all the bugs kind of differ from each other, right? But over time, we're gonna finesse together a theory that explains why the bugs differ from each other. In the case of ladybugs, there will be an evolutionary theory of ladybugs, how like one ladybug relates to other ladybugs. And then we can make predictions. If that is true, with these evolutionary pressures, we should see these changes. And of course, we can't do it with ladybugs, but with bacteria, we can actually do an experiment. We can do in a dish, we can say, if we introduce these these environmental changes, we're going to predict that that's what's going to happen to the bacteria, other kind of bugs, in the dish. And so one thing that's underappreciated, and I'll walk you through the slide in a moment, science formalizes, institutionalizes what people do anyway. You are an organism. Ard said an animal, it's kind of harsh. But you're an organism that's made out of matter, that takes in energy to process information. But you're not just doing this randomly. You make observations, like in this case, observation 1, 2, 3. Let's make it more precise. Let's say you observe Madison is mean to Alex. That's observation 1. Observation 2 is Madison is mean to Brett. Observation 3, Madison is mean to Corey, say. So you could realize that your explanation is Madison is a mean person, okay? That's my explanation. So my prediction is Madison, so that's my theory, it's Madison. My theory is Madison will be mean to me. And so my prediction and then action is I will stay away from Madison because Madison is a bad and mean person, okay? So that is what people do anyway. All of you have done this, okay? But why is this not enough? There's two issues that I'm going to raise why we need science, we can't just use lived experience. The first one is individual experience might not be representative. We did in our lab a study on bodybuilders, and we asked them, what proportion of people do you believe take anabolic steroids? What of the population, not of your friends? And the answer was something like 80, 90%. It's everybody. And this is called the false consensus effect. Your lived experience, as rich as it might not be representative. As a matter of fact, in this day and age where everybody watches their own shows and watches cat videos on YouTube and whatnot, your lived experience is probably just representative of you. Only the most delusional of us would think they're really representative of anybody else. And this is like an increasing problem. The second thing is what I would like to call, in general, individual cognition. That's what half of our field is about. It suffers from all kinds of biases. The most pernicious is probably confirmation bias, and let me just walk you through it. For thousands of years, people thought swans are white. Aristotle wrote a whole book about that. On swans, like it's the nature of the swan to be white, right? And for thousands of years, people believed that. Who are we to argue with the master, right? And for thousands of years, people saw swans, and yes, sure enough, they were white. However, as you know, that is not true. There are black swans, there's one staring down at you, and this is no joke. Confirmation, and we all have a tendency in human affairs to confirm our beliefs, to feel smarter, can really almost destroy Western civilization, as famously happened almost 10 years ago, over 10 years ago. What happened on Wall Street was that housing prices in all their models had always gone up. Every year, housing prices has gone up. And our prediction was they're going to go up next year. And they did, and we made a lot of money. And the Wall Street people placed bets, risky bets, that the house prices would always go up every year. It's confirmed every year. Until one year it didn't. And we almost inadvertently destroyed Western civilization as we know it. So these black swan events are very real. And by the way, the real black swans, Captain Cook sailed to Australia where swans happen to be black. Cygnus atratus is the biological name. So basically it doesn't come natural to do falsifications. The science does it institutionally. Now, what makes science so special is all of us here who have grown up with science, all of us have grown up with science. It wasn't invented in our lifetime. We kind of take for granted what happened before us. Is that for most of the time before science, most beliefs were just flat wrong. So for instance, here is the Ptolemaic worldview, as you might see, and as I could point out, let's click the word, the Earth is in the center. That is not what we believe. The sun is kind of here, the third planet out. That's exactly the other way around. We are the third planet off from the sun. Okay? But for thousands of years, the Ptolemaic worldview seemed to explain observations. And then this actually has a renaissance now. The flat Earth belief, for thousands of years, people believed that the Earth is flat. Just to be clear, why do people believe these things to be true? Because that's from lived experience. It looks like the sun is revolving around us. It looks like the Earth is flat. So science is transcending these obvious common sense beliefs. And just to throw on from neuroscience, for thousands of years, people thought that cognition has to do with the brain of the head, because if they cut it off, it stops. So people knew that, but they weren't sure which part does what. What they did realize was that in dead people, they found these holes, which are ventricles we know today. They are fluid-filled holes, and they thought that the ventricles, that's the computation and the cognition, because in all dead people they ever found, they had these holes. So sure enough, the soul must have lived there and left. And they actually had this whole theory. For instance, they had this like memory ventricle here. The idea was if you look up, this worm between the ventricles goes up and the memories flow out. So this whole cognitive dynamic theory of fluids, and so it's very sophisticated, it's just wrong. This is not true. The ventricles, to our knowledge, have no direct role in computation. It seems to be the matter, the gray matter around it, which Aristotle thought cools the blood, which is not true as far as we can tell. And importantly, so you have to really argue or wonder about science. So as Ard already said, the big work has already been done by people like Newton and Galileo. The idea is that the world is lawful. It's not just a bunch of random effects, which people thought before that. But you have to argue or wonder, does the world reveal itself to you? Or if this is actually an assumption or not. If the world reveals itself to special people, those special people can create a following and spread the gospel or write a book. And that's just not true in science. So this here is Darwin. If Darwin had never lived, there was someone waiting in the wings, Wallace, who made similar observations and wrote it together in a theory. He actually wrote a letter to Darwin. Hey, by the way, I observed these things. What do you think is interesting? Which actually pushed Darwin to accelerate his publication plans, which had been sitting on for 20 years. And the second thing is, science does not rely on a holy text. The idea is that there is no magic manual that the world came with that explains how it works, but we are writing a manual. So this is the Bible in my field, Principle of Neuroscience. I want to draw your attention to this point here. It's the 5th edition, okay? It's constantly in draft. I predict there will be a 6th edition. It's always changing. And hopefully it will get short at some point, so we'll actually find some principles, which is a bunch of 1,000 random facts. But anyway, one thing that I want to add about science, I started like that, that's very useful, but that's not the primary point. It's actually a miracle that is as useful as it is. It's not the primary point of science to be useful. The primary point of science is to understand natural phenomena. And that's actually very rare. All cultures had engineering. For instance, the Romans were concerned with irrigation and this is a Roman aqueduct, how do we get water to our cities? The Greeks were concerned with what is water? Thales. And he concluded everything is water. The Chinese, for instance, built walls and a lot of other people. And the idea was, well, how we can protect our civilization. But the Greeks asked, what is civilization? Mongol horse archers, to my knowledge, had no notion of science whatsoever. But there's a lot of engineering and technology on this slide. You have to domesticate horses. You have to create rudimentary forms of saddles and stirrups. You have to create a complex bow. You see what I'm saying? Like, so technology engineering, trying to make things useful, is very common. This passion study of natural phenomena is very rare. And it's a miracle that it works as well. So it probably suggests that there's something to that. For most of human history, science was too wrong to be useful. If you doubt that, read some early science. It's all wrong. But they had the right idea to try to test themselves. And finally, and this may be the most controversial thing, to my knowledge, science is the only framework that allows you to overcome original beliefs by the falsification emphasis. So let me give you an idea. If time progresses, over time, science kind of converges to one solution. I don't have time to go for this, but if you look at disease, okay, there was a lot of diverse thoughts of what caused disease. Some people thought it was bugs, bacteria. Other people had miasmatic, telluric, cosmic influences in childbed fever, for instance. Over time, they converged to one thing. So basically, they start from very different positions, they're priors, and they converge on one thing by science. Every other human endeavor, be it religion or not, splinters, okay? You have politics, you have sects, you basically, any other human belief system, you start with like a founder, a charismatic leader, a special person, a guru, but then then they die, and then people have to interpret what they said, or interpret the book they wrote, and then people splinter. And I know there's a lot of Christians in the room, so I want to be upsetting you. Actually, you picked this to be relevant. I could have done this with any other religion. So we have this with Christianity. So about every 500 years, you have a fundamental schism. You had one in the Council of Ephesus, then the Great Schism in the 11th century, then the Reformation. And actually, we're actually due for another one. I don't want to upset you, but we're due for another big schism. And if you go back, it's actually pretty crazy. Like today, we wonder why were they so upset. People killed each other over this. Millions of people died. But so for instance, in the early ones, the question was, what's the Trinity? What's the Holy Ghost? What's the nature of that? And people were like, what Holy Ghost? What are you talking about? In the Reformation, the question was, who gets to interpret the word of God? Is it the Pope, or is it everybody? Or priests, or everybody? And so you have this splintering, and you see this in everything else. Politics, you have Marxists, you have Maoists, Leninists, it gets complicated. And so to summarize, and I'm almost done, so if science is so great, what are some limitations of science? And one is that this works best, looking for these regularities. Science is all about, it's like a compression algorithm, looking for regularities, if there are simple elementary parts. So for instance, Ard here is from physics, so he can confirm this. We believe there's 4 fundamental forces, plus a bunch of elementary particles. I'm not going to go into detail, I'm running out of time. But these are, as we believe, all the fundamental particles, and that's it. And they make up all the complexity, including Ard, including you, that we observe. Chemistry is similar. Johannes, where's Johannes? There. You have about 100 neatly arranged elements, which make up all substances. So here's the periodic table of elements, and basically the idea is that they differ in the number of protons, the elements, they're not further divisible. And by the way, this is a description and then also an explanation. The reason they're different is because the number of electrons in their shell are different, so we predict they have different properties. So actually people filled this in over 250 years slowly. We could predict there's going to be element number 79, and that's new, and that's going to have certain properties because it has that number of electrons in the shell. So this is a very clean thing. This works best in physics and chemistry, sciences that are simple. All right. But we have now run into a wall of what I call diplexity in lots of fields. There's an increasing number of fields where we have just, the fundamental elements are not simple. They're complex and they're diverse. Biology, again, no time, but there's the microbiome. There's about 1,000 species of bacteria in your gut. They're always changing. Epigenetics, it's not just you have like a certain number of chromosomes, but the gene expression changes all the time with an interaction with the environment. And neuroscience, turns out, looks like we have about as many neurons in your head as there are stars in the galaxy, and they might all have their own genome. Psychology, people are different and complicated, and they change. Economics, I don't even know where to start. By the way, we can make no successful predictions. We have no idea. Okay, so basically, it's complicated. It's a good summary of this, and so we might need a new kind of science to address this. But let's reconnect with art. There are even more fundamental limitations. So if this is reality, there's an observable part, and I think science is very well equipped to address what questions about the observable universe. And then there's an unobservable part that contains why questions like metaphysics, why are we all here, and morality, what do we owe each other, or how should we treat each other. And science is not doing so well on that because it's relying on observations, and these things are not observable. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go through this, but there are some specific questions we can talk in the Q&A. Why is there anything? Why is there not just nothing? Why is this specific thing and nothing else? What are you? Why are you you, and why are you not me? Why are we not Ard? So maybe the most radical act of any entity is waking up today. Why today? All the choices that you made, and all your ancestors made, and all choices that Trevor's and Ard's ancestors made, all led you here with me. Why? Why today? Why now? It's very, very claustrophobic. And why? What's the point of all this? Maybe we are all living in aliens too. Who knows, right? Maybe this is maybe we are all died, we're in hell right now, making it hard for each other. And this is from my field. We can figure out the correlates of consciousness, but why would Ard said this, why would a sack of chemicals be conscious? A certain special sack with a certain configuration? That's bizarre. Johannes, the chemist, can't tell you that. And neither can I. So there is a place for faith in society, connected with art. The simple model was that religion is bad, superstition for thousands of years. Now we have science, now things are good. I think it's maybe a more complicated model is more appropriate. There is good science that focuses on observable and increasingly complex natural phenomena to improve the human condition. There's bad science that encroaches on metaphysics and morality, scientism, because we can't observe these things, we cannot bridge this gap. There's also good religion that focuses on pro-social morality and promoting virtues that help society. There's bad religion that encroaches on observable realities. For instance, I don't know, like all kinds of stuff. I don't want to get into details. But basically, most things that are written in the Bible about the nature of the world is wrong. It's not flat. There's nothing, the brain isn't mentioned. Or religions that promote hate or vices. So I think that's more sophisticated, more realistic. And with that, I thank you.
You kind of ended with, toward then, that our lived experience might not be representative. And so I kind of want to talk about the role of communities, so both in scientific communities and in religious communities. How do we protect against bias? How do we look at our own worldview? And maybe you can explain a little bit more about what your worldview is. You didn't go into that in the introduction.
My worldview?
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, here's the thing. So it happens to be what my lab studies. In brief, we have to assume, I recommend that, a stance of epistemic humility. Philosopher Nagel once asked, what's it like to be a bat? And the answer is we will never know what it's like to be a bat. I will go a step further, what's it like to be you? And we will never know what it's like to be you. And you will not know what it's like to be me. So, and we studied this, and the answer is people live in their own world. It's hard to, most people have a model that you will do what they do, that you will act what they do. It's called a theory of mind. But you have to take a step further and have a theory of the diversity of mind, that different people are into different things, like different things, will act differently. So a stance of social modesty, I guess, because life is complicated. What about you, Ard?
Same question. So I don't study this in my lab, so I have
Good for you.
to say.
The question is more about lived experience of community. So I think you were kind of pushing back against religion, as kind of a lived experience.
Actually, no. It's just not science, that's all. It's okay not to be science. Art is not a science. Art is not a science. Dance is not a science. There's lots of things that are not a science. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with it. Not everything has to be science. Science is good for giving answers about the natural world. That's it. That's very important, but that's not everything.
So I think, in our community, the question is, in our communities, either a faith community or a scientific community, how do we protect against bias? How do we kind of think about what we know and what we don't know?
Yeah, so I think, let me think about what you're trying to say. So how we protect against bias, I think is really, so here's one point. So part of the scientific methods, this is what my colleague Peter Harrison has shown very well, what the modern scientific method, one of the big changes actually came around the Reformation when people understood the doctrine of sin. The idea, this is the Christian doctrine, says that we're fallen, that we make errors very easily. And so one of the things that he shows is that you see this particular theological doctrine coming into, Roger Bacon and even in the early members of the Royal Society, thinking about this. So you see this with Boyle and others. And what they're advocating is no longer a kind of idea where you would sit down in your chair and think about the natural world and therefore get truth about it. You've got to go out and test it. So you see this with the first naturalist, John Ray, who's, before him, people would draw unicorns and mystical creatures because they believed they would be there and didn't care they didn't see them. And Ray said, and others said, well, look, but how do you know you're not fooling yourself? Let's go and test it. The second thing they pointed out is that they needed to have collective mechanisms. So in Oxford, for example, a bunch of them got together and founded what now become the Royal Society, the world's first scientific society. And the idea was that you had to present your work to others who would critique it. And for those of you that are in science, this can be very brutal and painful, or referees. But that's because we realize that we fool ourselves so incredibly easily. So science is something collective, and that collective nature of helping ourselves get rid of our biases is incredibly important. Now, in our own religious communities, the same ought to be true. And when religion works well, it does, and when it goes badly, it goes badly. I think you said religion can be bad, and it's a famous Archbishop Canterbury where he said that, it's not just that religion, things go bad, but they go really bad when religion goes bad. Right. And I think, but if you look at Jesus in the Gospels, he was continually calling out the religious teachers of the time for having all kinds of biases. They thought that they were good, but they weren't. And so one of the things that I think, healthy Christian faith teaches you is that you could be wrong about a lot of stuff. And so you need to be in a community with other Christians, for example, who can look into your life and say, are you sure you're not being a little bit selfish there? Are you sure you're not being a little bit, egotistical? Those kinds of things. And I think so. There's a parallel between this sense of the real understanding of the doctrine of the fall, which is part of the roots of the modern scientific method, and the way we would interact with one another in Christian communities.
If I can jump in there, those are good points, and I want to emphasize. If our field of psychology has shown anything, is that people are extremely easy to fool themselves, but you have to be careful for social things, because if you're not careful, if you don't have a diverse community of diverse thought, you are very easy to fool yourself into believing some crazy things, like flat Earth people, for instance. If you want to talk to other flat Earth society people, they will legit think that it's a real thing. So if you have a polarizing social phenomenon, you can actually amplify delusions, if that makes sense. So this social feedback only works if you have a diverse community.
Or if you have a community where people are cautious about their own...
Yeah, or modest.
Modest, yeah, exactly. So I think... and so, if you read I'm from a Christian background, so this is the one I understand. In Christianity, there's a lot of teaching about how as a community you should work together, how as a community you should keep one another accountable, how if you read some of the New Testament texts, there's some famous letters that someone like Paul, one of the writers of a big part of the New Testament, wrote to churches, and he really kind of goes at them because they're getting things wrong. And that's very humbling and very important. And to realize that we need that kind of input, all of us do. And I think also diversity. So one of the things I enjoy about doing these kind of Veritas forums, people ask me all kinds of questions I haven't thought about, and it's really important for me to get my own ideas questioned. And I think that's helpful, and I learned something from it. No pressure on the questions.
Does science have a diversity of thought and opinion?
Yeah, it does. Do we
get a group think as well in science?
Well, you have groupthink anything. You have these fads in fields, but at least the way it's supposed to work is that self-correcting. Like that someone will get up and say this is wrong and have the data to show it's wrong. But yeah, sure, okay, scientists are humans, believe it or not. It's hard to believe, but they're people too, and they come with all the biases that people have. They have egos, they get very jealous, they have to make a living, they have wives, they have spouses, they have kids. So yes, all of that. But the point is that at least if you're doing it right, you should be worried about that you're doing it wrong, if that makes sense.
Another thing I want to bring up, you mentioned Scientism.
It's pretty bad. Don't do it.
Yes. So I think I want to go ahead and make a distinction between science and scientism for people who may not be familiar. Go ahead.
Actually, if I might jump in, scientism is the worst perversion of science because science is supposed to be above this tribalism. But if you're a scientism guy, you make science just another tribe. That makes sense. It's like the ultimate perversion of the scientific method. You see, because you're supposed to be no better. That makes sense.
Yeah. So just to draw a distinction between science and scientism, from the American Academy for the Advancement of Science, they had an article by Thomas Burnett that said, if science is distinct from scientism, what is it? So science is an activity that seeks to explore the natural world using well-established, clearly delineated methods. Given the complexity of the universe, from the very big, which you study, Ard, to the very small, which you study, Pascal, from inorganic to organic, there's a vast array of scientific disciplines, each with its own specific techniques. The number of different specializations is constantly increasing, leading to more questions and areas of exploration than ever before. Science expands our understanding rather than limiting it. And then they go on to say, on the other hand, scientism is a speculative worldview about the ultimate reality of the universe and its meaning. And you'll hear explanations that rely on words like merely, only, simply, or nothing more than. And it says scientism restricts human inquiry. Ian Hutchinson, who's at MIT, states, the health of science is in fact jeopardized by scientism, not promoted by it. At the very least, it provokes a defensive, immunological, aggressive response from other intellectual communities in return for its own arrogance and intellectual bullyism. It taints science itself by association.
Can I give a specific example?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, go ahead.
Right, so we have to really respect the is-odd problem. What the is-odd problem is that science can tell you what the case is, all the things that are and all the things that are not. What it cannot tell you is, given that, what you should do about it. I'll give you a specific example. In my lab, these are psychopaths. And science can show psychopaths exist. They're really bad people. They have no empathy. They have no morality. They will hurt you and they will not feel bad about it. They might even enjoy it. And we have been able to show how many of them are. There's actually more than we thought. But here's the thing. Science cannot tell you what you should do about them. There's no way. Because how would you do that? Based on what Ard said, how would you value their rights to privacy versus society's right to not be victimized? So I have heard suggestions between like kill them all, sterilize them, ship them all to Madagascar, leave them alone, put them all in prison, everything, put them in a new institution, hire psychopath catchers, everything. But how would you adjudicate that? That's a social process. That's not a scientific process. Science cannot comment on that.
So this documentary series, Why Are We Here, was primarily about scientism. So I spent a lot of time all around the world with a friend of mine who's an atheist. So the two of us did it together, and he also doesn't like scientism. So we disagree on lots of things, except that we really don't like scientism. And so scientism is an interesting. Actually, somebody at your institution, Duke, Alex Rosenberg, was probably the world's most famous proponent of scientism. And I really enjoyed interacting with him, largely because I think he's so wrong. But he's at least consistent about it. And so what he basically says is the following, and I think it's a very careful understanding of scientism, which is, if the world is nothing but the laws of nature and that's it, so it's kind of physicalism, then that erodes away all ideas of value and morals, and a wide range of things that we consider important actually go away. And what Alex says, basically, you should just bite the bullet and realize this is true and believe it. I think he's fundamentally wrong. And one of the things that's explored in our film is that David, my kind of co-interviewer, believes in a kind of physicalism, but wants to hold on to some kind of objective morality and a whole series of things. That beauty is not something just a neurochemical process in your brain, but something beyond that, etc., etc., etc. And so we bounce this back and forth. So he really dislikes Alex because he thinks Alex has the right premises but the wrong conclusion. I think Alex has the wrong premises and therefore the wrong conclusion, but his logic is correct. And so part of the film was going around people and looking at this. And I think it's interesting because scientism, the idea that somehow the laws of physics and chemistry are all that there really is not often that well articulated in the way that Alex would articulate it. I think he's a very good philosopher, articulates it very well. But it does float around in the air around us. And so I think it's still a dangerous idea, because there's a sense, even in our universities, that somehow, real true things are these scientific things, and these other things are not really true. And therefore, we don't really have a good vocabulary in talking about them, because we worry that they somehow have left the realm of fact and into some kind of value-laden, emotional type of stuff that we were nervous talking about. And that is a vacuum, and I think that's a dangerous vacuum. And so I think we have to rehabilitate these kinds of discussions. And one way we can rehabilitate it is by putting a finger on scientism and pulling it out when we see it. Say, that is actually scientism, which you may believe in scientism, that's fine, right? But at least then we have a clear argument we can have, rather than having it be this kind of slightly grey thing floating in the background, but nevertheless influencing us.
I think I see this kind of in my own field. So HIV research, I watched a documentary a few years ago, How to Survive a Plague. And it really kind of changed my understanding of HIV is not just scientific, a disease, but it's also everything that goes with it, right? Stigma, things, in the best science and medical advances, we could have the truth, right? We can know how the disease works, we can know how to cure it. But, people do what they shouldn't do, and they don't do what they should do. And so how do we face that? How do we answer those kinds of questions? When we run up against the limits of science, where do we turn, and how do we kind of resolve that? Either one of you.
Yeah, so first of all, scientists need to resist the temptation to engage in scientism. I could write a very well-selling book saying that science can answer moral questions. There's more objective morality. People have. I'm not going to do that. Second thing is, because science cannot engage in that, we need to make sure we have very strong institutions, very strong moral leaders to fill that vacuum. Otherwise, charlatans will fill that vacuum too. So nature and society abhors these vacuum. What's the plural of vacuum? Vacui? Anyway, point is that you get the idea. We have to be careful and strong and not cede any inch of ground to these people.
I think we agree largely. I think so. It's not that science can't help us with moral understanding, because it can help us clarify what the question is sometimes. Just like, for example, if science tells me that somebody has a genetic propensity towards being a psychopath, that can help me understand maybe why they behave that way and realize that how I treat them would be different. So it can sharpen moral questions, but it fundamentally can't answer them. And so, and that doesn't mean that therefore there's easy answers to moral questions, but I think these are questions that need to be out in the open and be wrestled with in their full complexity, in public, in a pluralistic kind of environment, which is what we have, where people put their best arguments forward, and then these things get argued out. And I worry that science sometimes, in scientism, I think, so we both agree very strongly on this. Scientism, what it effectively does is so what really happens is somebody wraps themselves in the mantle of science, says science says this, and what they're really telling you is their own personal, private moral views, but because they wrap themselves in the mantle of science, it gives us a kind of extra weight. That's actually, it gives it a lot of weight. And that's a dangerous thing.
Yeah, so open society, diverse thought, diverse opinions, markets of ideas, be able to discuss everything without fear of losing your job, right? Or yes.
Great. I'd like to go back, Ard, to something you brought up in the beginning as well. So who has the burden of proof, kind of in this sense? An atheist, an agnostic, or a theist? Who's the burden of proof of saying, there is a God or there isn't a God, or how God intervenes in the world, if at all?
Well, so what I was hoping to argue was that there's a kind of default sometimes in the discussion that thinks that it's the theist who has the burden of proof. And that's because there's a misunderstanding of God as being an object out there that you can look for or not look for. And that's just a myth. That's not the God that I believe in. So I think that instead you have a more interesting, more complicated way of looking at it. And I would say if an atheist and I talk about this, we can both start from, there's no a priori argument that one's right or wrong from the beginning. I can do something like this. I can say, well, okay, if there is a God and I look at the world, does this make more sense of the world or not? Well, if there is a God behind the world, it makes a lot of sense of things like the fact that the world is uniform, the world is regular, the world is repeatable. Actually, if there's an intelligence behind the universe, it makes a lot more sense to the fact that the universe is in many ways intelligible. So science, I think, on balance, gives a lot more weight to the idea that there is a God behind the world. And if you're an atheist, you can believe those things, but they become brute facts. You've got to somehow add on, because there's no a priori reason why the world would not be irregular or chaotic. And so you can think of it, if I believe that there are moral truths that are true, Just like I believe that, this is an interesting point. People don't think moral truth is somehow vague, fluffy things, and there's no other non-physical reality. But a really simple example of a non-physical reality is mathematical truths, which most of us who do mathematics believe those things are true, but we don't believe they have to be physically instantiated. It's not like they're living somewhere behind the sun, right? They're absolutely true. So if I believe there are also moral truths of this kind, then they get it. On theism, that seems considerably more likely. So those are the kinds of things that make theism more likely. Suffering, on the other hand, is a much more complicated problem, and on theism, it gives a lot of problems for theism. But if the universe is exactly what you expect, if there's no good, no evil, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference, then suffering is not surprising. Although perhaps pain is not surprising. Suffering only really makes sense if you think that, or the problem of evil, suffering is something explainable. Whether it's evil or not becomes hard because there is no good, no evil, and so therefore that problem goes away, it gets washed out. But on atheism, it's easier to understand why they're suffering.
If I just might add to that, so the question is a category error because science deals with observations, and this is not a part of the observable truth, just like mathematical truths are not part of science or part of observable truth, as Ard said. So if you ask who is the burden of proof, you misunderstand what this is all about, if that makes sense. And the questions there are about metaphysics, like why is anything? Why are we here right now? Who are you? What am I? Which goes beyond that, if that makes sense. So and if you want to play that game, the burden of proof, well, if you're an atheist, how are you so sure? We agree there's absence of evidence, but are you so sure there's evidence of absence? You know what I mean? Like, who died and put you in charge of deciding that?
So why are we here?
Arrogance. Arrogant people. Go ahead.
So why are we here?
You tell me. Your guess is as good as mine. But the thing is, it's just bizarre. Have you ever been to a zoo? You wonder, is it possible that we are the apex predator and put all these other animals in a zoo? Or is it possible we are in a zoo right now, which would solve the Fermi's paradox, if that makes sense? So it's possible. Maybe this is all a test. Maybe if you create a paradise, maybe you want to be sure that only the best people get in there. So maybe that's what this is, right? Right? Who knows? So, or maybe it's a computer. Maybe we capture Ard in another world and use his brain to mine cryptocurrency, and it's just a simulation for him. There's no way to tell. Metaphysics is a fun game, but there's no way to tell.
Ard, any thoughts on why we're here?
No. So I think that fundamentally we are here because we are loved and desired by God. But I believe there's a God in this world who controls this world and who cares about us. And the way that you adjudicate questions of that nature, which has not been the topic today, is on different, it's not somehow moved into the realm of irrationality, it moves into different kinds of rational realms. So you can ask yourself questions like, is there a good historical arguments for the existence of Jesus Christ and what he said? Are the things that he said the kinds of things that you might expect if God came to earth in human form? Are there kind of good philosophical, theological arguments for why this makes sense? That's a whole different topic. I think Christianity is not only something which is existentially satisfying, it's also something which is intellectually satisfying. I think it has to be both of those for it to have the nature of truth.